everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 250 library systems across 37 states with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator, in conversation with each of the wonderful best-selling and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our Author Talk series. Today, we are honored and super excited to have New York Times bestselling author Lana Harper here to talk to us about her newest book from the Witches of Thistle Grove series, Back in a Spell. Hi, Lana. How are you?
Hi, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, we are super, super excited to dive in, but I want to pause for just a moment to give everybody that kind of standard quick housekeeping information that keeps everything running a little bit more smoothly, and then we will dive right in. So we have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will be taking your additional questions throughout the entirety of this conversation. So when you have a direct question for Lana, you can click that questions button that's below the live stream video at any time to submit your questions. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live stream chat box, also located below the stream. It's always fun to see where everybody's tuning in from. If you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you have to step away, that's okay. You will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours that you will find a link to the recording. So now to formally introduce our guest. Lana Harper is the New York Times bestselling author of the Witches of Thistle Grove series, including Payback's a Witch, From Bad to Cursed, and Back in a Spell. Writing, there you go, yay! Writing as Lana Popovich, if I said that right. She has also written 4 YA novels about modern-day witches and historical murderesses. Born in Serbia, Lana grew up in Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria before moving to the US, where she studied psychology and literature at Yale, law at Boston University, and publishing at Emerson College. She now lives in Chicago, where she spends most of her time plotting witchy stories and equally witchy tattoos. Again, welcome, Lana. Thank you for being here. So, are you one of those amazing people that speaks a ton of languages?
I don't know that it's amazing. I think for some people, like at least in Eastern Europe, it's just a byproduct of like jumping between countries. Like by the time I moved to the US for college, I had moved, I think, 8 times. So I was born in Serbia, and then my family was, they were kind of like first generation entrepreneurs after communism fell. And so we were like in Bulgaria and Romania, Hungary, bouncing back and forth so much that like you had to learn the languages, and some of them are close to each other, like Bulgarian and Serbian are pretty similar, but then Hungarian and Romanian are not at all. And so I just ended up picking up a lot of it and then studying languages later because I like languages. So yes, I do speak a number of languages, but I don't know that it's amazing. I think it's just like an artifact of the way that I grew up.
Yeah, definitely that. And it makes it easier for you to be able to study them later because your brain was kind of tuned that way. I think it's pretty cool. It's kind of like my superhero power, if I could choose one, would be to like understand any language in the world.
Yeah, no, I would too. Like a bunch of the languages that I studied, I don't remember anymore. And I feel like the fact that your brain just eventually gets rusty is a sad thing. And I would happily, like, if I could pick something, I think that would be maybe not my first pick superpower, but like second or third at least.
Yeah. So when did you decide that you wanted to become a writer? Was it like the imagination that you probably had to cultivate and jumping around to so many different countries?
I always had like I think what maybe some would call like weird and unseemly amounts of imagination. Like I was that weird neighborhood kid. Like we went on vacations in Montenegro, and I would walk like back and forth in front of my house, like making up stories and making expressions and stuff. And my grandma would be like, please don't do that. The neighbors like think you're strange. I don't like it. We need you to chill out with that stuff. So I've always been making up stories. And there was definitely a period in my life where I didn't think that was going to be my path. Like I went to law school. I thought, I'm going to have like a very standard sort of like a immigrant's journey to the US. Like I'm going to come here for college, I'm going to go to law school, I'm going to go become a lawyer. And then like about halfway through law school, I was like, oh, this is a bad path. Like, this is not something I should be doing. And so I started drafting my first novel while I was still in law school, mostly
Oh my
to
gosh.
change my mom's mind. She was like, well, if you're going to be a writer, shouldn't you write something? And I was like, correct. This is a fair challenge. So I started writing and finished it, and it never sold, but it was sort of, it gave me the legitimacy that I felt like I needed to end up changing course like pretty tremendously. So I've always been thinking about writing, like reading voraciously, and then eventually just writing all the time. So I guess in that sense, yeah, lifelong thing.
So it's kind of like you just have to force yourself to sit down and do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Like the more regular it is for me, like the more regimented it is, the better for me.
We always get a lot of questions about process and routine. So is there like a routine that you follow with your writing, a way that you structure it every time?
It's not necessarily a routine as much as it is that I like to make sure that I'm here for a certain amount of hours. It doesn't always look the same. So some days I sit down and I'm writing completely new material, and it's, like I want it to be 2,000 words, and that's what I'm going to hit that day. But sometimes it's like, oh, I'm reading back and I've noticed that this chapter needs to be shifted around. So as long as I'm doing something like some kind of work that is effective, even if it's editing or like larger kind of macro stuff, I still count that as working, but it does help me to be really regular about it. And as soon as I started showing up kind of, and once I started being full-time, I think that was easier because I had all this time suddenly to do whatever was writing adjacent. It was really, really great for productivity, and it worked really wonderfully for me.
Good. So Paula is asking if there's anything specifically that inspires you to write. So like those bad days where you just don't want to do it.
I think if anything, the more I write, the more I want to. So the more I think about it, the more I end up having those moments of like in the shower or before you fall asleep or you're waking up and you're having an idea moments. I think the more immersed in a project you are, the more impetus there is to be creating, or at least for me, it seems like it's like a perpetual motion thing. Like it's easier to keep going once you've generated enough momentum. So as I get deeper into something, I find more inspiration in just regular stuff. Things will pop into my brain. Things that I see on the street or just in life will remind me of something and then wind up kind of making appearances in my book. So I think making it a regular part of my life makes it easier for me to write. So it's like a normal continuous stream of inspiration as opposed to just being like, oh, I only have a certain amount of time to think about this. I'm not thinking about it all the time.
Yeah, that's really good. And I imagine that like taking the inspiration from so many different ways, or basically from anything, probably helped with your journey in between YA and adult. Marta is asking, what was that journey like changing between YA to an adult genre?
I had always wanted to write adult. YA was partly a matter of, well, not just a matter of convenience. I was representing a lot of authors in that genre. When I first started writing YA, I was a literary agent. And so it was very familiar ground. It seemed like I understood kind of where the market was at that point and how I could sort of contribute to it and where I could fit in. But even while I was writing in YA, a lot of the time my editors were like, we can't do this. Like, you have to cut that scene. This is not YA. We were not going to do this. And so it was a natural leap. Like I started feeling like the things that I really wanted to explore and the character arcs and the development that I was most interested in all tended adults. And so I was always looking for ways to kind of bridge the gap. So when I finally got to do that with Payback's a Witch, it was wonderful in that a lot of the restraints that I was feeling when it came to writing about things like sex and certain older kind of coming of age issues were suddenly available to me in a way that they weren't before. So it felt very natural to me. Like it didn't feel, the only thing that I struggled with was for a while, I was like, can I say certain things? Like, can I say these words? Like, am I, do I have some restrictions that are built in? And my editor was like, no, you're writing for adult people. You say whatever you want. And I was like, I don't know if I can handle all this freedom. So it took a minute for me to kind of like build up the head of steam to be able to kind of make confident decisions when I was writing more risque scenes or things that I hadn't talked about before. But it did feel like a very normal progression and one that I enjoyed very much.
Good. Christina is asking, how did you come to pick or gravitate toward the queer rom-com fantasy genre?
I have been writing queer books since the beginning. So those are the books that I always wanted to be reading when I was looking for books. And bisexual books specifically were interesting to me. I've always looked for bisexual heroines and very rarely found them in genre books. And there are like pretty standard, like significant outliers, like the Jacqueline Carey books. So like the Phaedra books and the Kushiel's Avatar cycle, those were fantastic. And I constantly wanted more of those. So when I started writing adult, I was like, I know what I want to be writing. I want to be writing queer romances or queer genres specifically. And how do I do that? The rom-com bit was interesting in that was a little bit more thoughtful than normally happens with my projects, like less spontaneous. I was at the time writing an adult thriller, and my agent and I were talking about like, what are the next steps? What are we going to do? And she mentioned that she had heard from editors in New York during her meetings that they were all somehow, which happens like back from when I was an agent, I noticed this was a pattern. It was like in the water. Suddenly everybody was like, we were just intrigued by the idea of witchy rom-coms. Like it's in the zeitgeist. We all want this. And so she was like, I know that you've been interested in doing witchy stuff, but for adults, and like, would a rom-com be cool? Like, what do you think? And so we hammered out this idea together, and it was a very collaborative process. It was like all of my interests all at once. I love witchy books. Witchy books are my brand. Every book I've ever written has witches in some capacity. I just never written a rom-com before, and I hadn't been writing adult. And so it all kind of came together in this very interesting sort of organic way that was also a little bit planned.
Well, speaking of witchy and witches, Frederick has asked, do you know any witches? Is that why you write about them?
Yes, I know a lot of witches. I know, well, depending on what you mean by witches. So, of course, there's Wiccans, and there are people who refer to themselves as witches because they practice witchcraft without any kind of religious affiliation. And then I myself have practiced in the past. I used to be a member of a Gardnerian coven. So I was a practicing Wiccan for a while. I'm not anymore, even though technically, like, you never really retire from that. You just kind of take sabbaticals. So yes, I know a lot of witches in a very different capacity than they're represented in the books. They're super cool, interesting people for the most part, with very varied life experiences. So I don't know that was what inspired me to write the books. I've been fascinated with witches and reading about them since I was very young. So I think it was more just like a natural kind of calling, like that's the subject matter that really excites me the most.
I love witches too.
Yeah.
So I want to backtrack for just, I guess not backtrack, but progress, because we have a couple of questions about research, but I think it might make more sense if you could talk to us a bit about the Witches of Thistle Grove series, and maybe even more specifically, its newest installment, maybe a sneak peek summary into the series and the new book, Back in a Spell.
Sure. So Thistle Grove, just as background, it is a witchy magical town in Illinois. I wasn't initially planning on making it be in Illinois because I was living in Boston back when I started writing, but then I moved to Chicago. This was like all very during the beginning of the pandemic, and I'd been planning this idea and sort of working on it, but not in earnest until I got here. And I was like, it's not really fair that New England has this monopoly on witches. Like Salem is the ultimate witchy town. Nowhere else has that sort of vibe. So I thought it would be cool to set it here instead of just do the standard kind of New England thing. And in the books, it's founded by 4 witch families. They're all drawn to it for different reasons. They're the Blackmoores, the Harlows, the Avramoffs, and the Thorns, and they all have different magical talents and affinities. But what they have in common is this magical lake on a mountaintop that is based on a real lake in Montenegro that I once visited. And it draws all of them together, and it also fuels the town's power. And we find out a lot more about it in Back in a Spell, which is the 3rd installment of the Witches of Thistle Grove series, and is the kind of the awkward first date leads to love sort of trope. So it was also difficult to write, or exciting and intriguing to write, because it was the Blackmoore family who are set up as villains. They're sort of very wealthy and overbearing, and they've had kind of the run of the town since the beginning because they're stronger than the rest of the families. And they've been winning in the first book, there's a magical gauntlet in which the families compete against each other to see who's in charge of the magic of the town. And we've known from the beginning that they're sort of like the cutout villains. Like, we all love to hate them or just hate them. And in this book, we're seeing it through the eyes of a Blackmoore protagonist. So it's Nina, who is a lawyer by day, a very powerful witch by night. And she ends up entangled with this kind of a Thistle Grove normie who doesn't have magical powers. It's Morty, who is the non-binary owner of the Shamrock Cauldron, which is this like witchy bar that a lot of the witches and the normies hang out at. And she experiences this completely unexplained surge of power after their first date, and Morty does as well develop magic. And so there's a mystery of what's happening to Nina. Why has Morty suddenly developed these new powers? What is at the bottom of this? Is it going to result in Nina being a villain, or is it going to be kind of her redemption arc in a very narrow way? So it was an interesting book to write because I was juggling, like, I don't want to create this broad redemption arc for this like relatively shitty family, but I also want to show that they're not this complete monolith. Like, they're made up of individuals, some of who are better than others. What does that look like? How difficult is it to be a member of that family? So that's Back in a Spell.
Thank you for that. I had an immediate question that popped to my mind just from my own curiosity. It's kind of going to go off book a little bit. But so when you were writing From Bad to Cursed and Nina made an appearance, did you know that the next book was going to be about her?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. That's usually how it happens. I'm not typically completely prepared to guess who the next book is going to be about, but almost always as I'm writing, I'm like, oh yes, this is the character, this is how it's going to go. And it's not always who I think it's going to be either.
Okay. Very interesting. Well, I want to get back to Lillian's question, which is, where do you find most of your research for witch-related content? I think that probably goes hand in hand with the fact that you used to be a practicing witch. But is there anything else that you find yourself going to or finding?
I have a library of witch books. I don't think any of them are visible. My witchcraft book shelf is a little bit lower than what shows up here. And a lot of the times, if there's something that I don't know, or if there's something that I want to be a little bit more accurate about, because the way that I'm writing magic here is so larger than life that it doesn't necessarily, like, this is not the kind of gritty sort of granular magic as I've experienced it in my dabbling with witchcraft. Like, this is the sort of outsized, larger than life, colossal magic that I think, as much as I like to keep it pinned down, or at least a little bit grounded in terms of what I've seen magic to be in our world, I don't find that to be like, I don't like it to be a constraint. Like, I want it to be exciting, like the theme park version of magic. So I don't spend a ton of time researching unless I'm like, okay, we're going to talk about a specific crystal or a specific herb, and I want to make sure that the magical properties that I'm ascribing to it are the ones that practitioners actually use. But these are not research heavy books. Like, I've done research for other books much deeper than I have for these ones.
Okay. I picture the Witches of Thistle Grove as a series for anyone and everyone. Like, I think that anyone could find themselves represented and welcome to live in Thistle Grove. But of course, that's me, a hetero and cis-normative individual speaking. So I can't speak for everyone. But that's the general feeling that I have. It's a place I want to live, but I'll have magical powers, to be clear. So, but Marilyn, that's all to say that Marilyn has a question about how to channel these types of characters. Marilyn's wondering if you're a non-binary person, or if you're not a non-binary person, how you feel comfortable writing about characters that are, and how you feel about others who write about genders and LGBTQ characters if they've never experienced it for themselves.
I think there's a fairly significant difference between writing from the perspective of a non-binary person as opposed to writing a non-binary person or someone whose identity you don't inhabit as a love interest as opposed to as your main character. I would not feel comfortable writing from the perspective of a non-binary person because I'm not one. I am a bisexual woman. I'm an immigrant. I have other identities, but these are not, I don't feel qualified to look, through the eyes of that person. However, I am a person who has been attracted to people of many different identities and orientations. So I think where I come down there is there are certain identities that I'm comfortable writing from the main character, first person narration perspective, but I'm not comfortable necessarily making them like anything other than that. So if I'm going to do something that's far beyond or relatively beyond my own identity, then I'm going to make that person a love interest just so that there's enough inclusion and diversity in the sense that this is a world where I'm trying to create what someone once called casual diversity, where it's like we're not talking about bisexuality, for example, as like an issue or a problem, like something where that's causing angst, and then the driver of the story is the characters trying to come to terms with those things, but it's incidental. Like this is a world where we're beyond trying to, no one is perceiving that as the plot of the story. It's simply who those people are, and the real kind of the painful trajectories and the difficult trajectories are just emotional things, obstacles that anybody might encounter in relationships or in their life. And I hope that, I don't know if that answers the question completely. So I personally don't feel comfortable writing those characters if I'm writing as them, but I do feel comfortable writing them as love interests.
Okay. Yeah. I think that was an incredibly insightful answer. Thank you. So it looks like Meg is asking, Nina's first appearance in From Bad to Cursed immediately made me interested in her, and I was so pleased that she was the protagonist of Back in a Spell. How are you deciding on who to focus? Which characters to develop? Also, thank you for including non-binary characters.
Thank you. I don't know. It really is. It's one of those mysterious processes where I don't like to think about it too much because I'm scared it'll stop happening. I don't really know. I have a rough idea, and I knew that I wanted to focus on a member of a different family each time. And part of actually your previous question that I didn't answer is we're now up to 4 books, and there will be a 5th book. There will not be a book from the Thorn perspective because the Thorns are a Black and biracial family, and I don't feel like it's my lane and my voice to be able to write those stories. And so though we've had love interests that are from the Thorn family, we don't get a Thorn narrator within the series. So part of it is just, who do I feel comfortable writing as, or from their standpoint, and then also just who would be interesting pairings, like what would be a challenging, unexpected, also something exciting, like things that I like certain tropes more than others. The 5th book that I haven't spoken about at all, but I will only say a little bit about it, is a second chance romance, which I've never written before. So that's going to be exciting, but it will not be a Blackmoore book again, which I know some people have talked about.
Okay. Like my brain immediately went there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, Gareth does not get a redemption arc. It's not happening. It's just not happening. I'm sorry and not sorry at all. So yeah.
Sorry, not sorry. So you said that the lake is inspired by a lake in Montenegro.
Yes.
And so that partially kind of answered mine and Jessica's question, which was what was your inspiration for the town of Thistle Grove? But I've wondered this, like reading the books throughout all three of them, because I lived in Chicago for a while, and so I'm a little familiar with Carbondale. I had friends that went to school there, and so I've looked at the maps so much to be like, where is Thistle Grove? Like, which town is it?
It's not in Illinois. So Thistle Grove is very loosely modeled after Salem in Massachusetts.
Okay.
So it's still not an Illinois town, but I cobbled together so many things that it is just not a place from any one town. The things that come from Salem are more sort of the general witch vibe, where Salem has this certain smell, like especially when you're walking down the main street and it's like Halloween season and all the witch stores have their doors open and it's like 17 different kinds of incense and it's very specific and very vibey. So I loved that. But the geography, like this lake, the apple orchards are very Massachusetts. That's something I really enjoyed while I was living there. And then the layout of the town and kind of the family domains. Those are just my favorite cheesy things. Like I love Renaissance fairs and medieval manor. Like I love those things, the medieval experience. I really love immersive haunted houses of all kinds, especially there's one in New York. It's not really a haunted house, but it's an immersive theater experience called Sleep No More. And so I was thinking of the Abramovs and the Arcane Emporium when I did that. Obviously, the Thorns have an apple orchard. I loved seeing there's Honey Pot Hill, I think. There is something very close to Honey Cake that I loved going to back when I was still living there. And Harlow, all the Harlow domains are basically just like every occult bookstore I've ever been in, especially one in Kentucky called Hierophany and Hedge, which is amazing. It's run by one of my college friends, and it's this beautiful, magical place in Covington, Kentucky. Like, not
everybody's writing that down now. So
it's gorgeous. It's so cool. It is like, and I tried to capture the details, and I was like, I'm never gonna be able to do this so granularly because they've really like made it into. Like walking in there is phenomenal. So that's what I was thinking of when I did Harlow House and Tomes and Omens.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So Chris wants to know how you came up with the idea for the particular magic system, like from the lake.
The lake, I always knew that the magic was going to come from the lake, but I will say that I wasn't sure exactly what was going on with the lake. And I did name it Ladies Lake. So I had some kind of subconscious notion that there was a goddess involved, but I didn't have a clear sense of what was happening up until, and actually I'm not going to get it because that's a little bit of a spoiler. I'm not going to get any deeper into that. But back in the spell, we find out more about why it's called Ladies Lake. By the time I had gotten there, I was like, wait, why is it called Ladies Lake? Like, we really got to nail this down. We're going to find out. And we do, more so than in the other books.
Is there anyone who within the Thistle Grove series that you relate to most? Haley would like to know, and which couple was your in the series was your favorite to write?
Oh, that's a tough one. I really love all the couples. I think Nina and Morty so far are my favorite couple. But it's difficult because I get so attached to each couple while I'm writing them, and then each new couple sort of supplants the one that came before. But it's really hard to, like, Talia and Emmy were the OGs. I love them so much. It's difficult. Nothing will ever come close to how I felt because they were such a refuge for me, and it was such a special relationship to write. So I think in the sense of being the first and being two bisexual women, they will always probably be that kind of favorite. But it seems it really, really shifts for me, I think, book to book so far anyway. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, it's amazing what you do because each book, it's like I can tell that it's your voice, but your writing voice anyway. But the tone is so specific for each character's story. So like you completely get lost in the new relationship that you're bringing us into. It's wonderful.
Thank you. I'm really glad that comes through. All of the books feel very different for me to write. Like it's almost like for me, it hasn't always been the case with other books that I've written, but a lot of these books feel like a very active kind of therapy for me, where all of them have a certain theme to them. Like Payback was the Book of Homecoming, and then From Bad to Cursed was the Book of Anxiety, and then the Back in a Spell is, in a sense, the book of generational trauma, or really just a book of trauma. And then the next one, which is Delilah's Story, was the Book of Rage. So it's like a much angrier, sort of scarier book than the other ones. And I think part of your previous question, which I didn't answer, was who do I relate closest to? This is a tough one. I would say Nina, but only because Nina's particular anxieties and her deeply neurotic nature are familiar to me. But in other ways, who was the most fun to write? That was Issa for sure. So I loved writing Issa, mostly because I don't have like any daredevil tendencies the way that she does. And so that was really fun because I was like, what would it be like to be a super badass? I wouldn't know. So let's just like lean into that.
Yeah. Well, Hannah agrees with you that there's a special place in her heart for Talia and Emmy, and Hannah wonders if you will revisit character stories from other books. I know that there are threads of them in each of the books, but have you thought about revisiting any of them at kind of like a where are they now?
Not in a significant novel length way. I've considered doing short stories for the characters, and I haven't done that, mostly because that's just not a medium I'm very familiar with. I do think in most of the books, or in the last two books, we do see more significant appearances of previous couples. So in that sense, like they're never really gone, especially Emmy. I mean, Emmy's in charge, and so she's there a lot of the time. And we see her in book 4 and in book 5. But I haven't thought of doing a separate book that really revisits any of the couples yet. Although it's not impossible. I just haven't done it because I get so excited and then really drawn into whatever the new couple is, and then that really kind of blots everything else out for a while.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions from a couple of different people pertaining to kind of Eastern European folklore. Both Marta and Sharon have asked how much of the magic practiced by the Avramov family is based on Eastern European folklore myths and fables. And Sharon, building on that, asks if you hope to include more in future novels.
Baba Yaga is a major influence on the Avramovs, and I've read a lot of stories about Baba Yaga. I tried not to be too heavy-handed in drawing on that, just because, again, I wanted this larger than life and not necessarily too bleak and creepy aspect. Like a lot of Slavic folklore is really dark. Like it's really it's very unsettling in a way that I enjoy in other books. But for these books, I wanted it to be this balance of like, okay, we're talking about demons, but it's not dismal and terrifying. Like it's just a very sort of different vibe. I think a comparison would be to something like Leigh Bardugo does an amazing job of really dark magic, and I love dark magic books. It's probably my favorite speculative genre. But for these books, I wanted it to be not necessarily one of those things where you're reading it and you're like, oh, now I'm gonna go dream about this and have nightmares. I wanted it to be a balance of like, this is, lighthearted to a certain degree, but also there's demons. How are these things both happening at once? So I do think there will be more Eastern European inspirations threaded in, but not necessarily very straightforward. I have written other books that are more directly drawn from Eastern European folklore, like the Hibiscus-Daughter duology. That was much more kind of Serbian and Montenegrine. That's where it was set. So these books are not intended to kind of draw very directly from that, just be like a reflection of the things that I grew up with.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Heather and many others, I guess, maybe based on that, being frightened by some of the Eastern European folklore, ask about curses. And do you really believe that curses are real? We had a lot of pre-submitted questions about curses.
Interesting. I believe that a lot of magic is real, in the sense that I think manifested thoughts can be real if you put like a lot of oomph into them. I don't really know to what degree I believe something is only real if the recipient believes that it's real. The way that I think about it is like, you know how it's like very uncomfortable to be in a room with somebody who like doesn't like you or that you have like bad vibes with? It's the same sort of thing where I believe that thoughts are powerful, that spoken will is powerful, that you can, to a certain degree, we shape reality with the way that we think about things and the way that we articulate things. So I think if you distill very negative energy in a very pointed way and maybe anchor it to certain things, I'm inclined to believe that probably that could happen. Do I think that it could be like a life devastating horror movie curse? Like, probably not. But I believe that someone thinking very negative, distilled thoughts about you could be a little bit uncomfortable in a way.
Yeah.
That's as far as I can go with that. Yeah, I don't know how hard I can commit to that, but I'm not willing to write it off, I think.
That's like me waiting to read the comments after the talks. No, I'm kidding. No. Like, they hated me. No.
Or me.
It's never you. It's
No, it could be me. It's okay. I'm ready.
So anyway, Alexis would like to know if you would ever make a visual representation, like a picture of the characters that you describe. So Alexis is saying, I'd love to see them come to life in what you pictured them to be.
I would also love to see them come to life. If I had any artistic talents, I would be doing this. Alas, I do not, at least in that in that respect. So I'm sort of confined to having it be brought to life visually by other very cool people. One of them being Rebecca Potos, who is an author and an agent and a former client who drew a beautiful picture of Issa and Rowan that I think I haven't ever posted on Instagram, but I think was in my newsletter. So at some point I'm going to put that up. It was gorgeous. And they're like cuddling in the tree after Issa's panic attack. And it was wonderful, but I am just not capable of doing it. I would love to be, but I'm not.
Maybe you could have, you could work on a graphic novel of like a story of Emmy and Talia being superheroes in Thistle Grove.
I would love that. I would be so excited. Like, really, that's the one talent where I'm always like, what would you like if you had a real, like a tangible thing that you could do? It's always like a real toss up between like, I would love to be able to sing properly and not the way that I do, and then also to draw. I think that's a very close thing. Like maybe drawing wins out by a little bit.
Yeah, both are embarrassing on my
Exactly. I'm like,
I tried to draw a potty for my daughter and I go, what is that? And she goes, it's boots.
I tried to draw a car for my son and he was like, oh, a chimney. And I was like, a chimney. Okay, well, no, we're just not going to do that again. Like, how did I even mess this up that bad? It's not hard.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So kind of on the same like artistic thread, Alexandra is asking, so will there be a family tree graphic included in the next book, or maybe the 5th one, or somewhere available online? I kept getting confused with Rowan's family, thinking about his twin sister Lyndon and then hearing about their younger sister. I absolutely love the first 2 books. Thank you. And thank you for expanding Morty's character. I wanted to know more about him since he was first introduced.
I don't think there will be a family tree graphic. I have floated this by the design team, but it's never come up as something that they wanted to do necessarily. I think because each family, or so far at least, has been sort of contained within each book, but it's something I might do because I know the way that they're related, and if it is confusing for readers, that's worth it to me to sort of try to pin that down a little bit. So I wouldn't discount the possibility of me like messing around and making a very sloppy and not very attractive family tree using whatever like app exists for doing that. I'm sure there's one out there, but I don't think we're going to see a formal one for any of the future books.
Okay. So what specifically prompted you to write Back in a Spell? So you knew that Nina Nina was next when you were writing From Bad to Cursed. So why was this the next story to tell?
Well, for one thing, the Blackmoores were up, so that was going to happen. And I needed, because I was also reluctant to tell a Blackmoore story because I had spent several books building them up into this very off-putting, villainous monolith of a family. I was trying to figure out how to create a vulnerable main character within that family. And Nina was, unlike her 2 brothers, she's just a more open avenue to criticizing them from the inside. She is just so laden with different kinds of trauma, not just trauma, but really just the kind of emotional littering that comes from growing up in a certain kind of family and with a certain kind of dynamic. And so she made sense to me. There are parts of her that I feel very keenly connected to, and I liked her so much more than I thought once I started writing. I was super nervous to write about her in the first place, and even while I was beginning, I was like, I don't know if I can do this. But she seemed to make the most sense to me. Like, how am I gonna delve into this without making people feel or making readers feel that I'm trying to give them this unearned redemption that I also don't believe that they deserve. However, some of them might be better than others. Like, it's not necessarily they're all cut from the same exact cloth. What if we had these outliers? What would they look like? Yeah. So that was really, she was sort of a canvas for that. And some of the things that she was going through during the book were things that I was going through while I was writing it. And it's the only one of the books where I cried while writing some of the scenes, because it felt so personal to me and so difficult to kind of get through some of that material. So she was just, I guess in that sense, she was a little bit closer to a mirror than some of the other characters were, even though I have almost nothing in common with her, including our zodiac signs. Like, we're very different people. We're just both very anxious, like very fraught. But that's about it. So yeah, that's how Nina became the next book. And then I had wanted to explore more of the elemental magic and the bigger kind of flashier, interesting magic that the Blackmoores do. So yeah, it really came together in a lot of different ways as the next one.
So let's talk about the Oblivion glamour for a second.
Yeah.
So for people who may not have started the series yet, can you explain what the Oblivion glamour is?
Sure. It's a very malleable spell that does what I need to do. It's a glamour. So it's a spell that's a town-wide spell that, as far as we know, the Abramoff family cast centuries ago. And the purpose is to keep normies or mundanes, the people who live in Thistle Grove or who are tourists and who witness magic, from remembering it as it's happening. So technically, the witch families are not really supposed to be practicing their magic in public, but sometimes it happens. Sometimes it's on purpose. Some of the Castle Camelot shows rely on magic as its special effects. So there's like loopholes. People won't remember a spell if they see it and they're like, whoa, that's magic. That couldn't have happened. Like, in that case, it kicks in. But if it's like woven into a weird little Broadway Cirque du Soleil type show, they're like, oh, that was special effects, it's fine, then they're going to remember. So it has like all these weird kind of ins and outs that families use it, you know, as per whatever it is that they're doing. Like the Thorns obviously use magic in their orchards and they're haunted, or like their special enchanted hedge maze, and the Abramoffs do the same thing at the Arcane Emporium and the haunted house. So there are exceptions to it, but the purpose is to keep normies from being like, what is this? This is a haunted magical town. Like, that's not okay. Like, we're gonna call the news. Like, that's not normal.
So in the first two books, I completely accepted that. Like, it was a necessary, it was a necessity living amongst humans. You don't want a repeat of the Salem witchcraft trial or Salem witch trials, Inquisition, when some human doesn't get their way and they yell witch. And Morty comes along and kind of completely halts that train of thought and truly makes me think about the potential moral and ethical implications of the Oblivion glamour. Were you saving this ethical dilemma tidbit for Morty, or did it just occur to you as the story developed?
It happened. Morty is such a sort of, as my editor called them, Morty is sort of the moral center of that story, as a counterpoint to Nina, because Nina has a stronger moral compass than a lot of her family, but has also been raised within this kind of ambiguous gray, like, well, we're strong, we just do what we want kind of environment. And Morty's like, no, this is wrong. Like, you're messing with people. You didn't ask them if that was cool. What do you mean? And so those conversations really rose very organically from the way that they relate to each other. And even at the end of the book, there wasn't a perfect answer to this, right? Like, there was like, okay, we should be able to cut carve exceptions from this more readily, but is there a cleaner way to do this? Is there a more right way to do this? I am saving that for down the line because yeah, I don't think it's necessarily awesome to have an entire town where everyone else is walking around being like, oh, forgot about this. Saw some magic, forgot about this again. Like got fried in the brains again by the oblivion glamour. So yeah, not cool on a grand scale.
Yeah, I seriously didn't even think about it until Morty pointed it out. And then I was like, oh.
Yeah, me neither. And I was like, oh yeah, should think about this closer and better.
So in each of the books so far, there's an element of at least like one of the characters having to leave and essentially kind of hide a core aspect of themselves from people as they begin to build relationships outside of Thistle Grove, right? So if they stay away for too long, their magic starts to wane. And so it kind of seems like, and Jerry wants to know, it seems that none of the witches of Thistle Grove can ever truly be wholly honest individuals outside of their families and communities. Is that intentional?
I'm hoping that that's not the case overall. That was part of what Nina's doing. So Nina's journey, without too many spoilers, I'm trying to think of how to say this. Nina struggles with this and comes to the realization that there is a way to balance this. It just requires maybe stepping away from these rules and norms that the witch community has imposed on themselves that the witches don't question as much as they might need to or should. So I don't know that it is necessary. I think it's one of those things where it's like, well, there's the establishment. In this case, the establishment is obviously very unusual and it's not the kind that we're accustomed to dealing with. But there is the sense that sometimes to be your whole person, you have to push back against the things that you've been taught, even if they are intended to be protective or they've been done for centuries. Like, well, is this really serving us anymore? Like, is this fair? Is this giving all of us kind of a fair treatment? So I think in Back in a Spell, hopefully the pushback is more apparent. Like, yes, I can be a whole person. I can bring all of myself to even people who don't necessarily know and trust them to be able to accept that a little bit more than was the case in the previous books. And it wasn't my intent to imply that there's always this held back aspect. It was just, that was sort of the artifact of like being a witch of Thistle Grove, but not like a beneficial one or one that we want to keep.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, it's nice to think about there being kind of like this loophole and this way out for them to be able to explore outside of Thistle Grove.
Mm-hmm.
So without giving too much away on my behalf, the amplification of Nina's magic, I'm not going to say why, in Back in a Spell kind of seemed to fit with her inner turmoil and emotional struggle. And it seems that she could have just given herself everything that she desired if she gave into it, but she didn't do that. She mostly remained good at heart and composed, but ultimately got what she wanted anyway. So was the magic in Back in a Spell with Nina supposed to be a metaphor for her inner struggle?
It wasn't intended to be a metaphor. Very rarely do I start something out with the knowledge that it's going to be a metaphor for something. And at some point I'm like, oh, wait, did I think that? Like, did I maybe somewhere deep in the recesses of my brain know that it was going to work out this way? I think as I started drafting it and realizing which way it was going, I didn't even fully acknowledge until I was talking to my editor about this. And she was like, this is like Nina's villain origin story if she had gone a different path, but she didn't. And so I think it's more about the fact that we always have a choice and how difficult that choice often is and how tempting it is, because Nina could have everything that she wanted, but is everything she wanted necessarily healthy and good for her? Part of what she wanted was to make her family happy and to do her best by them, but her family is this active malevolent force on her life, like a restriction and a suppression of who she really wants to be. So I think I was thinking of the magic as a transformative power, like something where she could experience what it felt like to be really strong and then figure out how to recreate that for herself as a person without necessarily using it as a crutch, because she could have just leaned into it and been like, what, this is going to be how I go about things. But she would have lost a lot of other things important to her, including possibly Morty. So it was more, Yeah, it was a device to showcase her development, but it was also just its own thing that she had to learn how to deal with and how to incorporate into the person that she really wanted to be the whole time.
Mm-hmm. It's incredible to me to think of the process as starting off not intending to do something, and then at some point, like it clicking and going, "Oh, I'm glad that I did that for myself." Like, does that take like just a lot of rereading? Does that how does that come
It's
up?
an I don't know really how it works. It seems to be the case for because I really think a lot of this, I was trying to explain this to someone, and the closest I could come to was like lucid dreaming, but on paper,
Mm,
where things tie together in ways that you don't know until later. And then once you see the connections, you go back and make them stronger. But there are these weird constellations of things that show up in early drafts, and then you notice them and you're like, I didn't know that was happening.
yeah.
I don't know what's happening. It does make me feel a little bit like some of this inspiration comes from somewhere that's not me and that's not my brain. It's like an external sort of thing, which sounds like very like woo woo, like, oh, the source is feeding me stories. Like, I'm pretty sure the source isn't like, ah, yes, witch stories straight into your brains. But there is that interesting sense of like, I'm not in full control of what I'm writing here, and I'm not going to understand until a little bit down the line. I do plot out a lot of this and I think about who the characters are going to be, but often there are major reversals and completely different outcomes than I thought were going to happen. It's mysterious to me, and again, I'm too scared to think about it too hard.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, what do you hope that readers take away from your series, and maybe even Back in a Spell specifically?
Mm-hmm. For Back in a Spell, I think Back in a Spell was very much sort of my light at the end of the tunnel book, where I was going through a lot of personal drama and turmoil and just difficult days. And I think the idea was there are always better days. And no matter how difficult things are, no matter how much you feel like the person that you want to be is out of reach, that's not necessarily the case. You have to step back or even just be willing to know that the suffering is going to end and that you're going to come out of it with a better understanding of what happened and with a better sense of who you're capable of being and how resilient you are. Um, I guess I was hoping for a hopeful message, even though it's a painful book and there are a lot of painful transformations. I think this one was especially like, don't be afraid to lean in. Like, it's okay to sometimes feel like you're absolutely broken and you're not going to be okay. Like, you will probably, hopefully, fingers crossed, be okay, and lean on people, do whatever you need to do to get there. It will happen. And I think that's the case with From Bad to Cursed as well, where Issa struggles pretty hard with her anxiety and panic and fears of disappointing her family. I think the family disappointment and just establishing yourself as an individual within and outside of the confines of your family are recurring themes in my books. And so that one is a strong one. And Back in a Spell, like, you can be happy and you can be a strong person, and sometimes it'll feel terrible, but sometimes it's necessary to create a new person who is more the you that you want to be than the person that you were, even though you thought, you know, before you got broken or something happened, that was who you wanted to be. It might not have been the full culmination of your identity.
Yeah. So, I think kind of related to the hopeful message, and readers taking that away from your work, Nico is asking, or stating and asking, we're unfortunately living in a time when there's a lot of challenges to books like yours, ones that include magic and LGBTQ plus folks. Why do you feel it's important to continue writing what you write in the face of these challenges?
Just for exactly that reason. There have to be those books. There have to be. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to exist as any kind of marginalized person, especially in a time of this increased pushback. I was talking to my partner recently about how America as it is now is so different from what I thought it was when I moved here, and that I wouldn't have believed that some of the things that are happening now could happen here. I was like, this is like Eastern European stuff. Like, this is the type of stuff that I saw growing up. Like, I wouldn't have thought that I would ever see this in the US. So when you have this kind of backdrop where things are being rolled back and it's harder than it should be, considering that we're living in 2023 and not, 15 or 20 or 100 years ago.
Yeah.
If you don't have books like this, like that's why I try to make identity and sexual orientation incidental instead of central to these books, where it's a world in which we are no longer devoting energy to being like, this is a difficult, angst producing part of my identity. It just is who I am. No one even questions me. No one even talks about it. I want it to seem happy, from, you know, whether it's a bisexual main character or a sapphic lesbian main character, as in book 4, or a non-binary love interest. I want those things to be components that are simply acknowledged. They're there. No one's going to think twice about them. And I think that by itself is the hopeful thing, the important thing, where it's just a normalization of any kind of identity in itself is an act, I think, of resistance and defiance against people who claim that those things are less valid or less important than standard, you know, your standard issue identities, which are the ones that I grew up with. And I felt very strongly about this as a bisexual woman, reading and looking for those relationships and very rarely finding them, especially in genre fiction. I always wanted to be writing those relationships, and I've been doing it since my YA books. So I think that's where you give everyone hope: young readers, adult readers, people who are only just maybe questioning their identities. Those books are the ultimate mirrors, and if you don't see yourself to some degree, it's very difficult to feel confident about where you're going.
What a beautiful message. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
We have some people pleading about, please say that book 5 will not be the end of Thistle Grove, Sharon says. And Ellie says, I honestly could read Thistle Grove books forever.
That is so wonderful. It's like the biggest gift that anyone has ever given me, to be able to write so many of these books. I don't know. I would love to be able to give an answer on that. I really honestly don't know. I do want to answer something because I saw a question pop up, and it was, I think, about the Clinton.
Yeah, the graphic.
Was it about this one? Yes. Author Courtney Kay sent me this. Her book is In the Event of Love, which I blurbed and loved very much. It's a bisexual romance, and she sent me this, and it's glorious and will always hold on my bookshelf. So that's what that is as a concern.
Good. Yeah, I couldn't, like, there was a glare on it for me, so
Yeah.
I couldn't see what it was.
I'm sorry, it's like my ring light acting up.
I'm just reading the spines of the books as you're talking. I'm not really paying attention. So
yeah, there's a lot of Charlene Harris and Jim Butcher on that side. And then the John Grishams are actually not mine. I'm like, why are you here? I think I inherited those from a previous place. And then this is one of my favorites, Monica Byrne, The Actual Star. Phenomenal. One of the smartest and most interesting books I've read in a very long time. Like, I was recommending it to everybody last year. That was my favorite last year. This year's favorite so far is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. Amazing.
Oh.
Amazing. Like, it was so dramatically wonderful that I texted my agent and I was like, I quit writing. This is the best book I will never be able to write a book like this book. I don't want to try it anymore. And she was like, why are you a baby? You can just say you really liked it. I was like, no, I would like to quit writing as part of my compliments to this book.
Is it completely narrative, or are there graphics as well?
There are no graphics whatsoever. It's like journal entry form. I've heard people compare it to the Veronica Speedwell books, but I don't know anything about those books at all. And so I don't know. It's like a Victorian sort of science plucky heroine, but it's beautiful. And the fairy lore is so interesting. It's just gorgeous. Like, the writing is really lovely. Like, the magic is so interesting that you're like, has Heather Fawcett done magic? Does she know fairies? Like, it's just very intricate and amazing. And so that's my favorite book of this year.
Okay, I'm gonna have to check that one out. Can we talk about Becky's question? Do you ever listen to music and find that it relates to any of your books? I know, like, I heard an interview by Lee Bardugo recently, and she listens to the exact same person every time she's writing. So do you have anything like that?
No, I don't. I can't write while listening to music because I get so distracted. But I do, while I'm writing, hear songs that end up then sounding like the sort of, for me anyway, the trademark soundtrack for the book. I have one song in mind right now for the book that I'm writing. I had an Emmy and Talia Spotify playlist somewhere. So these things do exist.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I just need to share them because I do have songs that I find reflect very strongly kind of the audio atmosphere that I'm experiencing while I'm writing, but I am not able. I wish I were, because that would be very cool, but I just can't. I have to have it be like deathly quiet while I'm writing.
So the quiet would distract me.
Yeah. Oh no, yeah, I wish. I can have white noise and that's fine, but anything with words, like, oh, it's over. Yeah.
All right. Well, it's the top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap up, but thank you so much. This has been such a fun talk.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you. I always feel like I'm rambling. On the stronger I get, like, very emotional about some of these questions, and I'm like, did that make sense? So thank you. Thank you for bearing with me.
It makes complete sense the whole way through, and people want to hear you talk, so it's okay. Also, I want to extend a huge thank you to all of our viewers, because of course, without all of you, none of this would be possible. So thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Lana's book. We will look forward to seeing you all on February 16th when we chat with National Book Award finalist Grace M. Cho about her memoir, Tastes Like War. And again, on February 28th, when we talk to award-winning author Sadekwa Johnson about her new book and the newest Reese's Book Club pick, The House of Eve. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and